For whatever reason or reasons, these two individuals were treated very violently after death, but before being laid to rest. Large wedge-shaped rocks had been forced into their mouths. Their limbs appeared to have been broken deliberately in several places to accommodate each of them having been folded around a large boulder. One of the rocks had been inserted so forcefully into the mouth of the deceased man that his jawbone had been dislocated.
Oh yeah.
Hello, and welcome back and joining us for this, the second out of 3 episodes in the series we are doing about archaeology and folklore, the entwinements and changes, like an arms race, with each developing to become or remain culturally relevant to the communities that live with these great archaeological sites as part of their everyday lives. In the previous video, we looked at how and where some of the myths and stories within our folklore may have come from, like with the Sidhe from ancestor worship, about how the folklore may have changed and the forces behind some of these changes, as well as what sites which kind of folklore tends to get attached to, explaining why passage tombs and similar sites are now associated with the Sidhe. In this episode, we'll be exploring deviant or vampire burials from here in Ireland, as well as the tale of the ancient Irish blood-drinking monster, known as Mary, my mother-in-law. The ancient Irish blood-drinking monster that inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula, known as the Abhartach. Also, in this episode, we'll be looking at the Greenfort in Sligo to show how folklore recorded by children in the 1930s contained unexplicit knowledge of this site, like at the Greenfort, that hadn't stood in over 330 years. We'll be concentrating more on not only how folklore can hold important bits of information, but how this information can be made evident in the archaeological record, remembering that each piece of archaeology is a freeze frame or snapshot from that spot in the past when it was last used.
One of the facets that's fascinating to see is just how the folklore may have affected the archaeology of a region, with the myths and legends that have become entwined with certain sites leading to the better preservation of those sites. Now, one might think that this may have been done deliberately in order to help make sure that these ancient sites got the respect and care they deserve. But that would probably just be wishful thinking. Wishful thinking because people in the past may not have known the true history of these places and were probably more concerned with just simply surviving. In reality, this could be more of a throwback to pre-Christian times when ancestor worship of some kind may have been practiced.
In that case, it would mean that the preservation of any site is merely the unintended byproduct of a pagan belief system that no longer formally gets used, but is still in part unknowingly followed. Following these stories and traditions have helped shape not just the culture that we've grown up and been influenced by, but the very landscape around us itself. Nearly every school child growing up in Ireland today, especially the ones near the countryside, know the dangers of messing with a fairy's fort. Either way, the themes that come up in these folklore are very important tools, as they can be used as tiny windows into the societies that created, or at least used the stories last, to help make better sense of the world around them. On the flip side, it is also interesting through the archaeology when we can see the folklore really coming back to life again, so to speak.
A great example of this would be what was revealed during the excavations carried out at the site of Kilteashin, County Roscommon in 2007. Marked on 19th century maps as the Bishop's Seat, surveys and excavations carried out between 2004 and 2006 revealed the remains of a mid-13th century Gaelic hall house. The hall house at Kilteashin would be one of the earliest documented examples and could be considered the classic form of hall house, with its first floor entrance, walls roughly 2 meters thick at the base and a rectangular plan, size roughly 15 by 7 meters in the internal measurements. One variant feature of hall houses is the presence of a batter at the base of the external walls, which is very pronounced here. The first mention of Kilteachin in the Annals of Connacht in 1249, which suggests a military function, with the Bishop of Elphin, Thomas O'Connor, who was first cousin of the O'Connors, who were the kings of Connacht at the time, and is recorded as having built a court or a palace here in 1253. During the excavations, the remains of about 130 individuals were unearthed, although it is believed by those excavating that there was probably close to another 3,000 individuals who were put to rest here. Evidently, as part of an early medieval graveyard, appeared to be used on again off again till around 1500, not long before the Spanish Armada, and was originally attached to a monastic settlement complex from around 700 AD. But what was really odd was that two of the individuals were just outside the graveyard boundaries and did not follow the standard mortuary practices of not just the rest of the site, but of the rest of all of Western Europe by that time.
Both of these were male. First one was estimated to be in his late 50s to early 60s, and the other in his mid-20s by the time of their death. For whatever reason or reasons, these two individuals were treated very violently after death, but before being laid to rest. Large wedge-shaped rocks had been forced into their mouths. Their limbs appeared to have been broken deliberately in several places to accommodate each of them having been folded around a large boulder. One of the rocks had been inserted so forcefully into the mouth of the deceased man that his jawbone had been dislocated. Another strange aspect of these burials was that they had not been laid west to east as in accordance with Christian burials practiced during this medieval period.
While there is very little recorded folklore about vampires in Ireland, this kind of treatment of singled out individuals is also seen across Europe and is deeply part of Norse belief systems of this time period. And that's why, in accordance with Irish folklore, a wrought iron item was often placed in a baby's crib to stop the she from stealing the child and leaving a changeling in its place. Originally thought to be from around the time of the Black Death, as during this time period, people tried a whole variety of different methods in different categories to try and hold back the terrible plague sweeping across the land. But after C14 dating was done, it was found that these two were from around 700 AD, which surprised the archaeologist working on the site. One of the main archaeologists in charge of this site, Chris Reed, said that these two men may have broken the conventional rules of their society in some particular or egregious way, such as murder, especially something like kinslaying, to get such treatment. One legend of a vampire from Irish mythology is the tale of the Abhartach, which, when translated into English, means dwarf. This story is from the townland of Schlaverty, near Derry, and the story goes that there was once a tyrannical chieftain who practiced the dark arts and, when he died, was buried standing up, a motif not uncommon in both Irish and European folklores, but then returned from death to feed on the blood of the people. A hero of the people set forth to track down and then vanquish the Abhartach. As is also not uncommon in Irish folklore, it took 3 attempts to do so, but on the 3rd attempt, the hero staked the Abhartach with a sword made of yew wood into his grave and then buried it upside down, and then covered the grave with thorns and a large boulder. The upside down burial might give some pause for thought, with some saying that it was assumed that these measurements would not hold the Abhartach forever, that he was buried with his head at the bottom, so when he awoke he'd be facing the wrong direction and would therefore be condemned to dig forever. Considering the broken limbs and the boulder-crushed corpses at the Kilteachin burial ground, it is tantalising to imagine that tales like these were probably what were driving the actions of the people at that time, who had in mind for their vampires the only way to properly deal with them. These deviant burials here at Kilteachin are an interesting find, and not just for showing that early medieval communities here in Ireland believed in revenants and vampires, as well as many other creepy ghouls and monsters. This is just one example of folklore and how it can be seen in the archaeology, how folklore can shape the archaeology rather than archaeology being shaped by the folklore, like what can be seen with the Sidhe, remnants of an Iron Age or perhaps even earlier belief system getting attached to our much later ring forts, defendable domestic sites built and used during the medieval period.
A concerted effort has been made in the academic world studying archaeology in Ireland of trying to reunite the folklore with their monuments and features in order to glean whatever valuable yet long overlooked nuggets information they may hold. Unfortunately, as with many things in life, the patterns often only become discernible after all the other pieces have revealed themselves. Even still, this is great to bear witness to, the potential passing down of historical knowledge, usually in the oral traditions that have been passed down in an unbroken chain for hundreds, if not thousands of years, hoping to impart what past generations thought would be important for future generations to know and learn from. Here we are, on top of the tallest hill, Fort Hill, in the townland of Rathquarter, directly overlooking the harbour town of Sligo to the southwest. This is the site of one of two bastion forts that guarded Sligo town. The other now completely gone, but was located down near the town hall on Quay Street. Known locally as the Greenfort, it was built in around 1599 by Conifers Clifford and is a sub-rectangular earthen ditch and bank structure with bastions at each of the four corners. Bastion forts, also known as star forts, first properly started being developed in Central Europe as a direct response to the increasing numbers, size and effectiveness of cannons on European battlefields of the 15th and 16th centuries. One particular section of warfare that was being hit particularly hard by this, all pun intended, was sieges. The previous stone castles with their perfectly masoned straight walls were great against the armies of just a century or two beforehand. When looking to take a castle or fort, they mostly relied on either the back-breaking work of sapping and undermining the defences, cutting the defenders off from the rest of the world and trying to wait them out, breaching the gates or scaling the walls, all of which were very costly in both time and personnel. With cannons, attackers could quite effectively take down the walls of a medieval fortification, shattering the stone that once held so high.
The Greenfort is one of 65 bastion forts here in Ireland, built mostly near coastal towns in order to try and hold and control the main routeways for military and trade at this time. Appearing on the Baxter's map of 1600, this site was probably built due to the 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603, and consisted of earthen artillery fortifications measuring about 86 metres by 90 metres externally, 45 by 49 metres internally, and standing about 4 metres high at its maximum, which enclosed an area of around 3100 metres. The fort comprises a raised rectangular platform with salient angle corner bastions, encircled by angled earthen slopes and ditches. There are no standing remains or features visible within the fort, such as an entrance, coverways, gun emplacements, the deep well, or any other similar features. Unlike the tall walls of medieval fortifications, bastion forts were often made from earth or brick, which could absorb the shock of a cannonball smacking into them much better than the previous stone, and had a much lower profile with slopes to help deflect the impact of these cannonballs, while also presenting a smaller target. The bastions, from where these forts get their name, at each of the corners provide flanking fire with their cannons on anyone approaching the fort, creating a deadly prospect for any attackers coming up the hill.
The Greenfort here quickly fell into disrepair and was out of use by the 1660s. But then, in the late 1680s, with the start of the Williamite Jacobite conflicts, 1688 to 1691, this site again became of strategic value. This is in part because Sligo is a gateway city, meaning that people travelling either north to south or vice versa on the western side of our island have to do so by passing through Sligo town, as it is ocean to the west and impassable mountains and bogs to the east. This made it perfect for launching raids into Ulster or for holding North Connacht. So, the Jacobites that were holding Sligo at the time put about 200 men to work in 1689, refurbishing and then rearming the fort with 16 cannons, as well as creating new outworks.
Unfortunately, for those defending it, these efforts were somewhat in vain, as the fort here was taken and retaken, falling into the hands of one side then the other several times before finally the Jacobite commander, Sir Tago Regan, surrendered the fort for the last time on the 15th of September 1691, but had arranged, as part of the terms agreed to, for the safe passage for himself and his men to leave the fort with their flags, company colours, small arms and supplies. Soon after this, with the end of the Williamite Jacobite War, the fort here was again abandoned and went into disrepair. The first recorded evidence of this site being called the Greenfort comes from the first edition of the 1837 OS map, which has the fort and its general shape marked and labelled. Before the Greenfort, the annals of the Four Masters record the presence of an early medieval ring fort here in 1595, as well as there being several other references to Rath na Britog, or Britain's Fort, translated as Fort of the Stuttering Women. An interesting story behind that name, I'm sure. All this suggests that an earlier ring fort may have been levelled in about 1600 to make room for the bastion fort. This is most likely the origin for the fairy stories related to this site.
A great source of information that has been used to help identify important pieces of information about certain archaeological sites was the stories found in the National Folklore Collection. This is a massive collection of folk traditions and stories that were gathered through various means at various times.
The main operators and arbiters of these collections were the Irish Folklore Institute, 1930 to 1935, the Irish Folklore Commission, 1935 to 1971, and the Department of Irish Folklore, UCD, 1972 to 2005. Also included are archived materials collected by the Folklore of Ireland Society, 1926 to present, who are closely associated with the National Folklore Collection. Since 2015, the collection has resided within the UCD library, although the majority of the collection can be viewed online with either UCD or with ducas.ie.
In particular, reading through the 1930 stories, I have personally found on multiple occasions to be quite useful when doing the background research on many sites. These stories that had been gathered by school children who were instructed to talk to their parents and grandparents, so to record their stories in special copybooks, which had been handed out to the children and then collected by the folklorists when the books were filled. It was in the reading of these stories that certain sites had revealed themselves. At least one story about the Greenfort has been preserved in the National Folklore Collection.
The people of Holborn Hill are as near to the Greenfort on the northern side as the people of the Mall are on the other side. People are very superstitious and they believe it to be unlucky for children or others to sleep on or get a fall on the Greenfort, as it is bewitched. A woman went up in the fort one summer's day a few years ago and she fell asleep with the heat of the day. After that, her friends noticed that she had lost her senses and she used to stray away. She would stand up during Mass and turn her apron and her shawl inside out. Her friends brought her every place to cure her, but it was no use. At last they were told that she had been spirited away by the good people, and the only cure was to get the clay from a priest's grave in Dromahare and to place it under her pillow. And when she had slept on the clay for 3 nights, they had to return it to the priest's grave. This was done, and the woman is now as strong and sensible as she ever was.
This story shows, if nothing else, some level of a local social awareness within the local community of a pre-existing ring fort at this site, even though it hadn't existed in over 330 years by the time the story was recorded. Interestingly, the story doesn't mention the ring fort explicitly, but rather just alludes to it with the presence of the otherworlders. Similar to how in other folk stories, the destruction or damage to a ring fort brought on the wrath of the Sidhe. In this case, to steal away people and leave in their place odd-acting changelings. This story is also another great example of how Christianity had come to gain precedence over the Sidhe in the eyes of the average folk, remembering now that the Sidhe were a representation of the old pre-Christian belief systems. This is seen in the cure to the affliction brought on by the Sidhe, that the only power strong enough to undo what the Sidhe had done was Catholicism, manifested in this narrative as the dirt from the priest's grave.
It is here that the local oral traditions can demonstrate the real historical value behind what academics probably would have dismissed offhand 100 years ago as the foolish nonsense of the lower classes, that had held no truth or value beyond keeping those lower classes entertained. Today for archaeologists, these bits of information are great as it helps them prepare a plan for dealing with and explaining features of a site, even before the first shovel meets the soil. If I was a fresh archaeologist in charge of the Greenfort site, and so was doing background research, these stories would help indicate about earlier settlements and fortifications at the site, so to monitor the site appropriately.
In this episode, we saw just how folklore can affect the archaeology. The evidence which shows us about people's attitudes and beliefs at the time affected any piece of archaeology that was put in the ground. This was seen in the unusual manner that the deviant or vampire burials were treated, and what this suggests not just about the two individuals, but about the wider community. While this video indicates the potential value in folklore to any archaeologist, all this starts to build a good background for our third and final episode in the series, which we'll be delving into for the depths of knowledge which could be held in some of these ancient stories. Thank you all for watching through. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, even a suggestion for another series, as well as share with family and friends. Here's hoping to be with you all again soon. Slán go fóill.